The bitter wind howled across the Wyoming plains, carrying with it the promise of a harsh winter as Xavier Patterson struggled to secure the last of his cattle in the corral. His weathered hands, cracked from years of hard labor, trembled against the biting cold that had descended upon Fort Laramie 3 weeks earlier than anyone had anticipated. The year was 1876, and like many ranchers in the territory, he'd been caught unprepared by the sudden turn in weather. Xavier wiped the ice crystals from his beard and gazed across his modest ranch. He'd built it all himself over the past 5 years, ever since returning from the war with nothing but determination and the skills he'd learned from his father. At 32, he'd carved out a life here, solitary but honest. The nearest neighbor was 3 miles away, and town was a half-day's ride in good weather. In this blizzard, it might as well be on the moon. As he trudged back toward his cabin, a movement at the edge of his property caught his eye. Squinting through the swirling snow, Xavier could make out a dark figure collapsing near the old oak tree that marked his eastern boundary. Without hesitation, he changed course, fighting against the wind that threatened to knock him off his feet. Drawing closer, he realized it was a woman, an Indian woman. Her clothes were inadequate for the brutal cold, and her lips had taken on a dangerous bluish tint. Judging by her traditional dress and beadwork, she appeared to be Apache, though what an Apache woman was doing this far north in Wyoming territory puzzled him briefly before urgency took precedence. "Madam, can you hear me?" Xavier knelt beside her, his voice nearly lost in the howling wind. Her eyes fluttered open, revealing deep brown irises clouded with pain and exhaustion. She tried to speak, but her words were lost in a violent shiver that racked her body. Without further deliberation, Xavier removed his heavy coat and wrapped it around her shoulders. She was small, perhaps 5 feet tall, making his coat envelop her like a blanket. Carefully, he lifted her into his arms, surprised at how light she felt despite the layers of his coat. "I'm taking you to my cabin," he explained, though he wasn't certain she understood English. "It's not far." The woman didn't resist as Xavier carried her through the deepening snow toward the warm glow of his cabin. Inside, he gently placed her near the fireplace and quickly added more logs to build up the heat. "My name is Xavier," he said slowly, pointing to himself. "Xavier Patterson." The woman watched him with wary eyes, still shivering despite the growing warmth. After a moment, she spoke in a voice barely above a whisper. "Fawn." She touched her chest. "Fawn Falling Water." Xavier nodded, relieved that she spoke at least some English. "You need dry clothes, Miss Falling Water. I don't have women's clothing, but I can offer you some of mine." He moved to a wooden trunk and pulled out a clean flannel shirt and wool pants that would be far too large for her but would serve better than her wet garments. He also retrieved his only spare blanket, a well-worn wool affair that had seen him through many winters. "I'll step outside while you change," Xavier said, placing the clothing and blanket beside her. "There's water heating on the stove for tea." He moved toward the door, but Fawn's voice stopped him. "Why help?" Her question was simple but loaded with justified suspicion. Xavier paused, his hand on the door. "Because you needed it. No one should freeze to death if I can prevent it." Outside, the wind howled with renewed ferocity as Xavier checked on his livestock once more. By the time he returned to the cabin, knocking gently before entering, Fawn had changed into his clothes. The shirt hung to her knees, and she'd had to roll the pants several times at the waist and ankles. She sat wrapped in the blanket, her wet garments spread before the fire to dry. "Tea," he offered, moving to the stove where the kettle whistled. Fawn nodded, watching his every move. Xavier poured 2 cups and handed one to her, careful not to make sudden movements. He recognized the look in her eyes. He'd seen it in wild horses and in men who'd survived the war. It was the look of someone ready to flee or fight at the slightest provocation. "What brings you to these parts?" he asked, settling into a chair at a respectful distance. "Apache lands are far south of here." Fawn sipped her tea before answering. "My mother was Apache. My father was Lakota. I was traveling to my father's people when storm came." She gestured toward the window where snow was piling up against the glass. "Others in my party did not survive raid by white men. I escaped but lost my horse 2 days ago." Xavier's face darkened. "I'm sorry about your companions. There are lawless men in these parts, both white and Indian." He hesitated before adding, "You're welcome to shelter here until the storm passes. It's not much, but it's warm and safe." Fawn met his gaze directly for the first time. "Why should I trust white man?" "You shouldn't necessarily," Xavier replied honestly. "But I give you my word that no harm will come to you under my roof. When the weather clears, I'll help you reach your father's people if that's what you wish." The fire crackled in the silence that followed. Outside, the temperature continued to drop as night descended upon the ranch. Xavier moved about the cabin, preparing a simple meal of beans and salt pork with the last of his cornbread. "Are you hungry?" he asked, setting a plate before her. Fawn nodded, accepting the food gratefully. They ate in silence, the howl of the wind and the crackling of the fire the only sounds in the small cabin. As night deepened, Xavier arranged blankets on the floor near the fire. "You can take the bed," he offered, gesturing to the simple wooden frame against the far wall. Fawn looked at him with suspicion. "And you?" "I'll sleep here by the fire," Xavier explained. "It's plenty warm." Hesitantly, Fawn moved to the bed, still wrapped in his blanket. Xavier settled onto his makeshift bedding, turning his back to give her privacy. He heard the creak of the bed as she lay down. "Thank you," came her voice softly through the darkness. "For blanket, for warmth." "You're welcome, Miss Falling Water," Xavier replied. "Rest now. We'll see what tomorrow brings." As he drifted to sleep with the storm raging outside, Xavier couldn't have known that tomorrow would bring the worst blizzard Fort Laramie had seen in 50 years, or that the woman now sleeping in his bed would change the course of his life forever. When Xavier awoke the next morning, the world outside his window had disappeared beneath a sea of white. The snow had drifted against the cabin, nearly reaching the windowsill, and it continued to fall in thick, heavy flakes that obscured everything beyond a few feet. He stoked the fire first, adding the last of the logs from the indoor pile, then turned to check on his guest. Fawn was already awake, sitting on the edge of the bed, watching him with those cautious eyes. Her long black hair had dried overnight and now fell in waves past her shoulders, contrasting sharply with the pale fabric of his shirt. "Morning," he said. "Looks like we're snowed in for the day. Maybe longer." Fawn moved to the window, peering out at the white expanse. "Bad medicine," she murmured. "Winter's spirit is angry." "Seems that way," Xavier agreed. "I need to check on my cattle and bring in more firewood. Will you be all right here for a few minutes?" She nodded, returning to sit by the fire. Xavier bundled up in his heaviest clothes, pulling on thick gloves and his battered hat. "There's coffee in the tin by the stove if you'd like some. I won't be long." Outside, the cold hit him like a physical blow. The wind had died down, but the temperature had dropped even further overnight. Xavier waded through snow up to his thighs to reach the barn, relieved to find his cattle huddled together, cold but alive. He fed them extra hay, knowing they would need the energy to generate warmth. The woodpile was partially buried, and it took him nearly an hour to dig out enough logs to last a few days. By the time he returned to the cabin, his arms laden with wood, His extremities were numb despite his gloves and boots. Inside, the cabin was surprisingly warm, and the aroma of coffee filled the air. Fawn had taken the initiative to brew a pot and was now tending to a skillet of frying salt pork. "You cook," Xavier observed, stamping snow from his boots. "All women learn," she replied simply, turning the meat in the pan. "Sit. Warm yourself." Xavier shed his outer layers and settled by the fire, accepting the steaming mug of coffee she handed him. "Thank you. The cattle are fine, but this storm isn't letting up any time soon. We might be stuck here for days." Fawn nodded, serving up the salt pork alongside some beans she'd evidently found and heated. "Food will run low." "We'll manage," Xavier assured her, though he knew she was right. He hadn't been planning on feeding 2 people through a prolonged storm. "I've got some preserves in the root cellar, and there's always the possibility of hunting if it clears enough." They ate in comfortable silence, the awkwardness of the previous night giving way to the practicalities of survival. After breakfast, Xavier took stock of their supplies while Fawn washed the dishes using melted snow. "Your clothes should be dry now," Xavier mentioned, noticing her traditional dress and leggings hanging by the fire, "though they don't look warm enough for this weather." Fawn ran her fingers over the intricate beadwork on her dress. "Made for desert, not snow. Your clothes warmer." She hesitated before adding, "If you do not mind, keep them as long as you need," Xavier replied. "I have others." As the day wore on, they fell into a rhythm of necessary tasks, melting snow for water, tending the fire, and preparing the cabin for extended isolation. Xavier found himself impressed by Fawn's resourcefulness. She mended a tear in one of his shirts without being asked, and helped rearrange furniture to better conserve heat. By mid-afternoon, the monotony began to weigh on them, and Xavier retrieved a deck of cards from a drawer. "Do you play?" Fawn shook her head. "Show me." Xavier taught her a simple game of 5-card draw, using beans as betting chips. Her serious expression as she considered her cards made him smile despite himself. It had been years since he'd had company in his cabin, even longer since that company had been female. "You smile at my playing?" Fawn asked, noticing his expression. "No, madam," Xavier corrected quickly. "Just enjoying the company. It gets lonely out here sometimes." Fawn studied him, her head tilted slightly. "No wife, no family," Xavier shook his head. "Had a sweetheart before the war. Rebecca was her name. She married someone else while I was fighting. Can't blame her. 4 years is a long time to wait with no guarantees." He cleared his throat, uncomfortable with sharing so much. "What about you? Were you married among your mother's people?" A shadow crossed Fawn's face. "Was promised to Chief's son. He died in raid, same raid that scattered my people." She laid down her cards, a pair of 2s. "Now I journey to father's people, to start new life." Xavier nodded, recognizing the grief she carried. He showed his hand 3 queens and gathered the cards to shuffle again. "I'm sorry about your intended. War and violence have taken too much from too many." As evening approached, Xavier made another trip to check on his cattle and bring in more wood. This time, Fawn insisted on helping, wrapping herself in his spare coat and following him out into the snow. Together they worked faster, her small form surprisingly strong as she carried armloads of logs back to the cabin. At one point, Fawn stopped and tilted her head back, snowflakes landing on her face. "It is beautiful," she said softly, "even in its danger." Xavier paused beside her, seeing the winter landscape anew through her eyes. The pristine white blanket, the crystalline sparkle of ice on tree branches, the absolute stillness broken only by their breathing. "Yes," he agreed, "beautiful and dangerous, like many worthwhile things in life." Their eyes met briefly, and something unspoken passed between them, a moment of perfect understanding between two people who had survived their share of hardships. Then Fawn blinked, and the moment passed as she turned back toward the cabin with her load of wood. That night, Xavier insisted Fawn keep the bed while he again made do with blankets near the fire. The storm continued unabated, promising at least another day of confinement. As he drifted toward sleep, Xavier realized he wasn't as bothered by their predicament as he should be. In fact, there was something comforting about having another soul nearby in the endless white wilderness. "Xavier," Fawn's voice came softly through the darkness. "Yes, in your people's stories, does winter ever end?" Xavier smiled at the ceiling. "Always. Spring always comes eventually." "That's the way of things." "Good," she whispered. "I will wait for spring." Little did either of them know how those words would come to define the months ahead. The blizzard lasted 4 days, dumping nearly 3 feet of snow across the Wyoming plains. During that time, Xavier and Fawn established a routine that made the most of their confined circumstances. Mornings were spent on essential tasks caring for the livestock, collecting and melting snow, and preparing simple meals from their dwindling supplies. Afternoons were filled with card games, conversation, and the sharing of stories from their vastly different upbringings. Xavier learned that Fawn was 24 years old, born to an Apache mother and a Lakota father who had been a trader between the tribes. Her father had returned to his people when she was just 7, and she had been raised in the Apache ways until the raids scattered her band. Now she sought her father's people, having heard they were camped near Fort Laramie for the winter. In turn, Xavier told her about growing up on a small farm in Pennsylvania, joining the Union Army at 18, and coming west after the war to start anew where the nightmares of battle might not follow so easily. He spoke of learning ranching from an old-timer who'd taken him under his wing, then saving enough to buy this plot of land 5 years ago. On the 5th day, the snow finally stopped, but the temperature remained bitterly cold. The drifts around the cabin were deep enough in places to reach the roof. Xavier knew they couldn't possibly clear a path to town, nor could Fawn continue her journey in these conditions. "You'll have to stay until the thaw," he told her over breakfast. "It might be weeks, maybe more." Fawn nodded, accepting the reality of their situation. "I will earn my keep," she promised. "Teach me your ranch work." And so began a partnership born of necessity. Xavier showed Fawn how to care for the cattle, how to mend fences when they could reach them through the snow, and how to identify which animals needed extra attention in the harsh conditions. She proved to be a quick study, her natural affinity with animals making the work easier. In the evenings, Fawn taught Xavier words in Apache and Lakota, laughing at his pronunciation. She showed him how to make pemmican when their meat stores ran dangerously low, combining the last of his dried beef with rendered fat and dried berries she discovered in his pantry. "This will keep us strong," she explained, offering him a piece of the concentrated food. "Apache women make this for warriors who must travel far." One evening, about 2 weeks into their cohabitation, Xavier noticed Fawn shivering despite the fire's warmth. The temperature had plummeted again, and the wind had picked up, finding every crack and crevice in the cabin's construction. "Here," Xavier said, removing his blanket from the bed and offering it to her. It was his last one, as she already used the spare he'd given her that first night. "Take this too." Fawn looked at him, her brow furrowed. "Then you will be cold." Xavier shrugged. "I've got the fire and my coat." "No," Fawn shook her head decisively. "We share." She patted the space beside her on the bed which they had been taking turns using. "Fire dies in night." "Too cold for floor." Xavier hesitated, aware of the impropriety of such an arrangement. "Miss Falling Water, I don't think." "Fawn," she corrected. And I think we are two people surviving winter, nothing more." Her expression was matter-of-fact practical. "Unless white man's thoughts are impure." Xavier felt his face warm. "No, madam, just trying to be respectful." Fawn's lips curved slightly. "Respect is good, so is warmth. We sleep back to back. For warmth only." After another moment's hesitation, Xavier nodded. The practicality of her suggestion couldn't be denied. That night, they slept side by side on the narrow bed, their backs touching, sharing both blankets. Despite his concerns about propriety, Xavier slept better than he had in weeks. As January gave way to February, the arrangement became routine. They worked together during the day, shared meals, stories, and the bed at night, always with a proper distance maintained, always with respect. Yet something was changing between them, as imperceptible and inevitable as the lengthening of days. Xavier found himself noticing things about Fawn he hadn't before: the way her eyes crinkled at the corners when she smiled, the graceful efficiency of her movements, the depth of wisdom in her observations about life and nature. For her part, Fawn began to stand closer to him as they worked, to touch his arm when she spoke, to laugh more freely at his dry humor. On a particularly cold night in mid-February, Xavier woke to find that they had shifted in their sleep. Fawn was curled against his chest, her breathing deep and even, one hand resting over his heart. He knew he should move away, return to their agreed-upon arrangement, but he couldn't bring himself to disturb her peaceful sleep. Instead, he closed his eyes and allowed himself to savor the warmth and comfort of human closeness he'd been without for so long. When morning came, Fawn said nothing about their changed position, but her eyes held his a moment longer than usual as she handed him his coffee. That evening she sat closer to him by the fire as they played cards, and when they retired to bed, she didn't turn her back immediately. "Xavier," she said softly, facing him in the dim light, "why did you give me your blanket that first night? You did not know me, I was stranger. Enemy, maybe." Xavier considered her question carefully. "You weren't an enemy, you were a person who needed help. The blanket was just the right thing to do." Fawn studied his face, her dark eyes reflecting the last embers of the fire. Many men would not see it so. Many would leave a Apache woman to die in snow. "I'm not many men," Xavier replied simply. Fawn reached out then, her fingers gently touching his bearded cheek. "No," she agreed, "you are not." Then she turned away, assuming their usual back-to-back position, leaving Xavier to ponder the significance of that touch long into the night. The following week brought a brief respite from the cold, not a thaw exactly, but a few days where the temperature rose enough to make outdoor work less punishing. Xavier took the opportunity to ride to his nearest neighbor, Frank Miller, to check on the old man and replenish some of their supplies. "Brought a woman home, have you?" Frank chuckled when Xavier mentioned his house guest. "An Indian gal, no less. Town'll be talking about that for months." "It's not like that," Xavier protested. "She was stranded in the storm. I'm just helping her until spring when she can reach her father's people." Frank raised a bushy eyebrow. "Sure, son. And I'm just saying, no one would blame you if it was like that. Been on your own too long as it is." Xavier returned to the ranch with coffee, sugar, flour, and Frank's words echoing in his mind. Was there truth to the old man's implication? Had his feelings for Fawn grown beyond simple companionship and respect? When he rode into the yard, Fawn emerged from the barn, her face lighting up at his return. She had been caring for the cattle in his absence, her hair tied back with a strip of leather, his too large clothes cinched at the waist with rope. The sight of her capable, resilient, beautiful in a way that had nothing to do with conventional standards made something shift in Xavier's chest. "Welcome back," she called, walking toward him. Animals are fed. One calf seems sick, breathing strange. Xavier dismounted, handing her a package wrapped in brown paper. Brought you something. Fawn unwrapped the package to reveal a warm woolen shawl in rich earth tones. It's beautiful, she breathed, running her fingers over the soft fabric. Mrs. Miller had it, Xavier explained. Said she never wears it anymore. Thought it might suit you better than my old shirts. Fawn immediately wrapped it around her shoulders, the colors complementing her copper skin and dark hair perfectly. Thank you, she said, her voice soft with genuine pleasure. That evening, after they'd treated the sick calf and enjoyed a supper enhanced by the fresh supplies, Fawn sat cross-legged by the fire, sewing beads onto the edge of her new shawl. She'd found the beads among her few possessions, small treasures she'd managed to keep during her flight from the raid. In my culture, she explained as she worked, beadwork tells stories. Each pattern has meaning. She pointed to a diamond shape she'd created. This represents journey, and this, she indicated a series of connected circles, means family. Not blood family, but those who become family by choice and circumstance. Xavier watched her nimble fingers work, mesmerized by the emerging pattern. And what does that represent? He asked, pointing to a third design she was beginning. Fawn's hands stilled and she looked up at him with an expression he couldn't quite read. Two paths becoming one, she said quietly. It is a pattern for special friendship. Something in her tone made Xavier's heart beat faster. Is that what we have, a special friendship? Fawn set aside her beadwork and moved to sit beside him on the bench. What would you call it, Xavier Patterson? The question hung in the air between them, laden with possibilities. Xavier found himself at a crossroads, aware that his answer would irrevocably change things between them. I'd call it a beginning, he said finally, his voice low, of something I never expected to find out here. Fawn's eyes searched his, and whatever she found there seemed to satisfy her. Slowly, deliberately, she leaned forward and pressed her lips to his in a kiss as gentle as falling snow. When she pulled back, her expression was solemn but not uncertain. A beginning, she agreed, if you want it. Xavier reached up to touch her cheek, his calloused fingers gentle against her skin. I want it, he answered, though I don't know where it leads or what challenges we'll face. Fawn smiled then, a full smile that transformed her serious face. No one knows path ahead. We walk it together, step by step. That night, when they lay down to sleep, they faced each other for the first time, talking in low voices until the fire died down. Xavier told her about his childhood, about the war's horrors, about his dreams for the ranch. Fawn spoke of her mother's wisdom, the traditions of her people, her fear and hope when she'd set out to find her father's tribe. In the intimate darkness, they shared their first real embrace, not the accidental closeness of sleep, but a conscious decision to hold and be held. Nothing more happened between them that night, but a boundary had been crossed, a new territory entered as surely as pioneers crossing a mountain pass. As February turned to March, their relationship deepened alongside the first subtle signs of the coming spring. The days grew incrementally longer, and occasionally the sun emerged strong enough to melt the snow on the cabin's south-facing side. Fawn continued to wear Xavier's clothes with her new shawl, but she added beadwork to the collar of one of his old shirts, transforming it into something uniquely hers. Their days fell into a pleasant rhythm of shared work and growing intimacy. Xavier taught Fawn to shoot his rifle, impressed by her steady aim and quick mastery. Fawn showed Xavier how to identify useful plants beneath the snow and how to set snares for rabbits to supplement their diet. In the evenings, they sat close together by the fire, sometimes reading from Xavier's small collection of books, sometimes just talking. Physical affection between them developed gradually, hands held while walking to the barn, a kiss before parting to do separate chores, embraces that lingered longer each day. Xavier, mindful of respecting her boundaries, let Fawn set the pace of their growing intimacy. One evening in mid-March, as they sat on the porch watching the sunset paint the snow-covered landscape in hues of pink and gold, Fawn turned to Xavier with unusual seriousness. "When spring truly comes," she said, "and paths are clear again, what happens then?" Xavier had been thinking about this question for weeks, turning possibilities over in his mind. "What do you want to happen?" Fawn looked out at the melting snow. "I still wish to find my father, to know if he lives, but I do not wish to leave here, to leave you." She met his gaze directly. "Among my mother's people, when a woman chooses a man, she may go to live in his dwelling. If he accepts her, they become as husband and wife." Xavier's heart raced at the implication. "Are you choosing me, Fawn?" She nodded, her expression a mixture of vulnerability and certainty. "If you will have me, if you are not ashamed to take Apache woman as wife." Xavier took her hands in his. "I could never be ashamed of you. You're the strongest, wisest person I've ever known." He squeezed her hands gently. "But I need you to be sure. Life won't be easy for us. There will be people, white and Indian both, who won't accept our union." "I am sure," Fawn replied without hesitation. "My heart has chosen." "Has yours?" In answer, Xavier drew her into his arms and kissed her with all the emotion that had been building over the long winter months. When they finally parted, both breathless, he rested his forehead against hers. "Yes," he whispered. "My heart chose you the moment you opened your eyes in the snow. I just didn't know it yet." That night, their relationship was consummated with tender passion, their bodies joining as their lives had already begun to do. Afterward, as Fawn slept peacefully in his arms, Xavier gazed at the ceiling, marveling at how a chance encounter in a snowstorm had led to this profound change in his life. For the first time since returning from the war, he felt truly hopeful about the future. The next morning, Xavier woke early and slipped out of bed without disturbing Fawn. He had something important to do. In his tool chest, he found a small piece of silver he'd been saving $50 from before the war. With painstaking care, he used his smallest hammer and a nail to work the edges of the coin, shaping it into a simple ring. When Fawn awoke, she found Xavier kneeling beside the bed, the makeshift ring held between his fingers. "Among my people," he said, "a man gives a ring to the woman he wishes to marry. I don't have much Fawn Falling Water, but everything I have, this land, this home, my future, I offer to share with you. Will you be my wife, not just in the Apache way, but in the white man's way as well?" Tears filled Fawn's eyes as she extended her hand, allowing Xavier to slide the silver ring onto her finger. "Yes," she whispered. "In all ways, in all traditions, I will be your wife." They sealed their engagement with a kiss that promised a lifetime of shared moments, both joyful and difficult, ahead of them. As March progressed, the snow began to melt in earnest, revealing the brown earth beneath. New calves were born, filling the days with the demanding but rewarding work of spring on a cattle ranch. Xavier and Fawn worked side by side, their efficiency as partners increasing as they learned to anticipate each other's needs and movements. With the clearing of the main roads, Xavier made a trip into Fort Laramie, returning with supplies and news. He'd spoken to the preacher about performing a wedding ceremony and had received a mixed response. "He'll do it," Xavier told Fawn as they unloaded the wagon. "But he warned me that not everyone will approve, said some folks might make trouble." Fawn's expression remained calm. "This surprises you," Xavier sighed. "No, but I had hoped. Well, people can surprise you sometimes, for better or worse. When do we marry?" Fawn asked practically, setting aside a sack of flour. 2 weeks from Sunday, if that suits you, gives us time to prepare and for the roads to improve further. Xavier hesitated before adding, I also asked about your father's people. There's a band of Lakota camped about 20 miles north of here, near the river. We could visit them after we're married, see if your father is among them. Fawn's face lit up with hope. You would do this, even though some Lakota still fight white men. Xavier took her hand, running his thumb over the silver ring she wore. They're to be my family too if your father lives. I want you to have that connection, that piece of yourself. Tears welled in Fawn's eyes and she embraced him tightly. You are a good man, Xavier Patterson. Better than I dreamed when I prayed for help in snowstorm. The following weeks were filled with preparations. Xavier repaired and painted the cabin, determined to make their home as welcoming as possible for his bride. Fawn created a special dress for the ceremony, combining elements of her Apache heritage with materials Xavier brought from town. Together, they cleaned the barn and prepared for the small gathering that would follow their wedding. Just a few of Xavier's friends, whom he believed would accept his choice of bride. 3 days before the wedding, disaster struck. Xavier and Fawn were checking fence lines at the far edge of the property when they spotted smoke rising from the direction of the cabin. They raced back on horseback to find the barn engulfed in flames, several of their cattle already dead, others bellowing in fear and pain. Working frantically, they managed to save most of the livestock and prevent the fire from spreading to the cabin. But the barn was a complete loss, along with the hay stored inside and the equipment Xavier had worked years to acquire. As they stood surveying the smoldering ruins, exhausted and smoke-stained, Xavier noticed something that made his blood run cold. A torch dropped near the origin point of the fire, and footprints leading away toward town. This was no accident, he said grimly. Someone did this deliberately. Fawn's face hardened. Because of me, because you marry Indian woman. Xavier pulled her into his arms, heedless of the soot and ash covering them both. We don't know that for certain, and even if it's true, it changes nothing. I still want to marry you. We'll rebuild stronger than before. Fawn searched his face, finding only determination there. You do not regret. Your life was peaceful before I came. Peaceful isn't the same as happy, Xavier replied. I'd rather have happiness with challenges than peace with loneliness. He kissed her forehead. We'll get through this together. That evening, as they sat on the porch watching the last wisps of smoke dissipate from the barn's remains, they heard horses approaching. Xavier reached for his rifle, but relaxed when he recognized Frank Miller leading a group of 5 other ranchers from nearby properties. Heard about your trouble, Frank called as they dismounted. Came to help. Xavier stood, moving protectively in front of Fawn. You know who did this? Frank shook his head. Got my suspicions. Jebediah Turner and his boys were drinking heavy in town last night, talking nonsense about race mixing and such. The old man spat disgustedly. But that's not why we're here. We came to help rebuild. Can't have a wedding with no barn for the celebration, now can we? One by one, the other ranchers nodded their agreement, some looking at Fawn with curiosity, others with cautious acceptance, but none with open hostility. You do that? Xavier asked, genuinely surprised. Even knowing I'm marrying an Apache woman. One of the younger ranchers, Thomas Reed, stepped forward. My wife's half Cherokee, he said simply. Been married 6 years now, best decision I ever made. He nodded respectfully to Fawn. Madam. Relief and gratitude washed over Xavier. I don't know what to say except thank you. We could use the help. Well, don't just stand there then, Frank barked good-naturedly. Let's get these ladies some coffee while us men figure out what lumber we'll need. Fawn raised an eyebrow at being grouped with ladies who weren't present, but there was a hint of amusement in her expression as she went to prepare coffee for their unexpected guests. The next 2 days saw a flurry of activity as neighbors came together to raise a new barn. It wasn't as large as the original, but it was sturdy and more than adequate for Xavier's modest herd. Women from neighboring ranches arrived with food and well wishes, some openly curious about Fawn, others making genuine efforts at friendship. By the day before the wedding, the new barn was complete enough for use, though finishing touches would come later. That evening, as Xavier and Fawn sat exhausted but content on their porch, Frank Miller returned with his wife. "Got something for you," the old man said, handing Xavier a small package. "Wedding present." Inside was a pair of simple gold bands. "These were my parents," Frank explained. "Martha and I have our own and we've no children to pass them to. Thought you two could use them tomorrow." Xavier was momentarily speechless at the generosity of the gift. "Frank, I can't accept." "Sure you can," Frank interrupted. "Call it payment for that bull calf you let me have last spring, or don't call it anything. Just take the damn rings and be happy." Fawn stepped forward and, in a gesture that surprised both men, embraced the old rancher. "Thank you," she said simply. "For rings, for barn, for acceptance." Frank patted her awkwardly on the back, clearly unused to such displays. "You're good for him," he said gruffly. "Anyone with eyes can see that. The rest don't matter." The wedding day dawned clear and mild, as if nature itself approved of the union. The ceremony was held outside the newly rebuilt barn, with Reverend Johnson officiating. Despite the controversy, a fair number of people from Fort Laramie and surrounding ranches attended, some out of genuine good wishes, others perhaps from curiosity. Fawn wore her special dress, a beautiful fusion of cultures with traditional Apache beadwork adorning a design that echoed Western wedding gowns. Her long hair was braided with wildflowers, and she carried a bouquet of early spring blooms gathered that morning. Xavier, freshly shaven and dressed in his best clothes, waited for her with undisguised admiration as she walked toward him on Frank Miller's arm. The ceremony was brief but meaningful, with Xavier and Fawn exchanging both the traditional Christian vows and promises in Fawn's native language. When Reverend Johnson pronounced them husband and wife, Xavier kissed his bride to applause from most of the gathered crowd. The celebration that followed was a true Western affair, with a feast contributed by neighboring families, music from a local fiddler, and dancing that lasted well into the evening. Not everyone from town had come, and a few who did maintained a cool distance, but the majority seemed willing to accept, if not entirely understand, Xavier's choice of bride. As the sun began to set, casting long shadows across the ranch, Xavier pulled Fawn away from the festivities for a moment of privacy behind their cabin. "Are you happy, Mrs. Patterson?" he asked, still marveling at the reality of their marriage. Fawn smiled up at him, her dark eyes reflecting the golden light of sunset. "More than I thought possible when winter took me in its grasp." She touched his face gently. "You gave me blanket, gave me shelter. Now you give me name, give me home, give me future. I will spend lifetime repaying this gift." Xavier shook his head. "No repayment needed. You've given me just as much purpose, companionship, love." He kissed her softly. "I was existing before you came. Now I'm living." They returned to their guests hand in hand, ready to begin the next chapter of their unexpected journey together. The spring of 1877 brought new beginnings and challenges for the Pattersons. With the barn rebuilt and their marriage established, Xavier and Fawn turned their attention to the promise they'd made to search for her father among the Lakota camped north of Fort Laramie. 2 weeks after their wedding, they packed supplies for a journey of several days and set out on horseback toward the Lakota encampment. Xavier had sent word ahead through an army scout who traded with the tribe, hoping to smooth their arrival. As they approached the camp on the third day, they were met by a party of Lakota warriors who escorted them the final distance with solemn faces and watchful eyes. Xavier felt the weight of their scrutiny, but kept his posture relaxed and open, following Fawn's lead in the proper protocols. The camp was larger than Xavier had expected, with dozens of tipis arranged in a traditional circle. Women paused in their work to watch the newcomers. Children peered curiously from behind their mothers, and men gathered to assess the unusual sight of a white rancher and an Apache woman arriving together. An older man with long gray braids and deeply lined face stepped forward to meet them. Fawn spoke to him in Lakota, her voice respectful but firm. After a brief exchange, the man's stern expression softened slightly, and he gestured for them to dismount. "He is Singing Bear, an elder," Fawn explained to Xavier as they tied their horses. "He remembers my father and will take us to speak with the chief." They were led to a large tipi at the center of the camp. Inside, several men sat in a circle, including one whom Xavier assumed was the chief based on his ceremonial dress and the deference shown to him by others. What followed was a complex conversation in Lakota, with Fawn occasionally translating the essence for Xavier. She explained her identity, her mother's fate, and her search for her father. The chief, named Black Hawk, listened intently before speaking at length to the gathered men. After what seemed like hours, Fawn turned to Xavier with tears in her eyes. "My father lives," she said, her voice thick with emotion. "He is hunting with a party of men but will return in 2 days. We are invited to stay until then." Xavier squeezed her hand, sharing in her joy. "That's wonderful news." They were given a small tipi for their use, and over the next 2 days, they were gradually accepted into the rhythms of the camp. Xavier observed Fawn as she reconnected with aspects of her father's culture, noting how she seamlessly adapted to the customs and language, filling in gaps in her knowledge with careful observation and questions to the women who cautiously welcomed her. For his part, Xavier tried to make himself useful, helping with repairs to a hunting wagon and offering advice on a sick horse. His willingness to work and learn earned him a measure of respect from the Lakota men, though many remained understandably wary of a white man in their midst. On the evening of the second day, there was a commotion at the edge of the camp. The hunting party had returned, successful and laden with meat. Fawn stood nervously as the hunters were greeted by their families, her eyes scanning the group for a face she hadn't seen since childhood. A tall man with streaks of gray in his black hair separated from the others, alerted by whispers about the visitors. He stood perfectly still, staring at Fawn as if seeing a ghost. "Little Fawn?" he asked in disbelief. "Daughter." With a cry, Fawn ran to him, and he caught her in a powerful embrace that lifted her off her feet. They spoke rapidly in Lakota, tears streaming down both their faces as 17 years of separation collapsed in a moment of recognition. Xavier watched from a respectful distance, deeply moved by the reunion. After several minutes, Fawn beckoned him forward. "Father, this is my husband, Xavier Patterson," she said in English. "He saved my life in winter storm and has given me a new home." Fawn's father, whose name was Swift Elk, looked Xavier over with penetrating eyes. "You take my daughter as wife?" he asked in accented but clear English. "Why?" Xavier met the man's gaze directly. "Because I love her. Because she's the strongest, wisest person I've ever known. Because my life is better with her in it." Swift Elk considered this, then extended his hand in the white man's custom of greeting. My daughter has her mother's heart and my stubbornness. You will need strength." A hint of amusement flickered in his eyes as he glanced at Fawn. That night, there was a feast to celebrate both the successful hunt and the reunion of Swift Elk with his daughter. Xavier and Fawn were given places of honor in the circle, and as the night progressed, Xavier found himself engaged in surprisingly candid conversations with several of the Lakota men. "You live where?" Swift Elk asked as they shared a pipe passed among the men. Xavier described his ranch, its location, and the cattle he raised. "It's not large, but it's good land, enough to support a family." Swift Elk nodded thoughtfully. "My people's lands grow smaller each year. Treaties broken, buffalo gone." He looked at Xavier intently. What future for mixed family in white man's world? It was a profound question, one Xavier had asked himself many times. "I won't pretend it will be easy," he answered honestly. "There will always be those who disapprove. But there are good people, 2 neighbors who helped rebuild our barn when it was burned, friends who stood with us at our wedding." He glanced at Fawn, who was deep in conversation with her father's wife and other women nearby. "We'll make our own path, create our own future." Swift Elk seemed satisfied with this answer. "My daughter has chosen well," he declared. "You have honest eyes." The visit lasted 5 days, during which Fawn reconnected with her father and learned about her Lakota relatives. Xavier observed the customs and traditions of the camp, gaining a deeper appreciation for this part of his wife's heritage. By the time they prepared to leave, promises had been made for future visits, and Swift Elk had given them gifts to mark his blessing of their union: a beautifully tanned buffalo hide for their home, and a pair of finely crafted moccasins for each of them. "You will return when snow flies again," Swift Elk told them as they mounted their horses. "Family should not be separated by seasons." Fawn embraced her father one last time. "We will return," she promised, "and you must visit our ranch when hunting brings you near." As they rode away, Xavier noticed the lightness in Fawn's bearing, as if a weight had been lifted from her shoulders. "You found a piece of yourself," he observed. She nodded, smiling. "I am whole now. Apache mother, Lakota father, American husband." She reached across to touch his hand. All parts together make Fawn Patterson. Summer brought the demanding work of a cattle ranch, branding calves, mending fences, and preparing for the eventual fall roundup. Fawn proved to be as skilled with cattle as she was with other aspects of ranch life, her natural affinity for animals and quick learning making her an equal partner in the operation. Word of their unusual marriage had spread beyond Fort Laramie, bringing occasional curious visitors and, unfortunately, continued hostility from some quarters. Jebediah Turner and his sons made a point of sneering comments whenever Xavier and Fawn visited town, though they stopped short of further violence after learning that many of the local ranchers supported the Pattersons. In late July, Fawn approached Xavier as he repaired a broken wagon wheel, her expression a mixture of nervousness and joy. "I have news," she said quietly. Xavier set down his tools, immediately alert to the significance in her tone. "What is it?" Fawn took his hand and placed it on her stomach, still flat beneath her dress. "New life grows here," she said simply. "Our child comes with winter." For a moment, Xavier couldn't speak, overwhelmed by the implications. Then he whooped with joy, lifting Fawn and spinning her around before quickly setting her down again, suddenly concerned about jarring her. "A baby," he breathed, his hand returning to her stomach with reverence. "Our baby." Fawn smiled at his reaction. "You are happy." "Beyond happy," Xavier assured her, kissing her deeply. "Though I'm also terrified. I know nothing about being a father." "And I know little about being mother," Fawn admitted. "But we learn together as we have learned everything else." The news of their coming child added urgency to their preparations for winter. Xavier hired 2 hands from town to help with the fall roundup, young men named Caleb and Joseph, who seemed unbothered by working for a man with an Indian wife. With their help, the ranch's operations expanded slightly, with more cattle brought to market than Xavier had managed on his own in previous years. As Fawn's pregnancy progressed, she remained active in the daily work of the ranch, though Xavier insisted she avoid the more strenuous or dangerous tasks. This led to their first real argument as a married couple, with Fawn bristling at being treated as fragile. "Apache women work until birthday," she informed him hotly. "I am not weak flour to be kept in house." "I know you're strong," Xavier replied, equally stubborn. "But this is our first child, and I won't risk either of you unnecessarily. There's a difference between caution and coddling." They eventually reached a compromise, with Fawn continuing most of her usual duties, but agreeing to accept help with anything that might put strain on her changing body. The resolution of the conflict brought them closer, establishing a pattern of honest communication that would serve them well in the years to come. In October, Swift Elk arrived at the ranch with 2 other Lakota men, fulfilling his promise to visit. He was visibly moved by the sight of his daughter's rounded belly, placing his hand upon it with reverent wonder. "Strong child grows here," he pronounced. "Child of 2 worlds like mother." During his week-long stay, Swift Elk helped Xavier prepare the ranch for winter, offering wisdom about weather patterns and survival techniques that complemented Xavier's established routines. The men developed a genuine respect for one another, finding common ground in their practical approaches to life and their shared love for Fawn. Before departing, Swift Elk performed a blessing ceremony for the unborn child, burning sweet grass and offering prayers in Lakota while Xavier and Fawn sat wrapped in the buffalo hide he had given them. It was a powerful moment of cultural connection that Xavier knew he would remember all his life. Winter arrived early again that year, though not as severely as the previous one. With the improved barn, additional hay stored, and lessons learned from past experience, the ranch weathered the first storms comfortably. Xavier hired Joseph to stay on through the winter, providing an extra pair of hands as Fawn's pregnancy advanced. On a snowy night in early December, Fawn went into labor. Xavier sent Joseph to fetch both the town doctor and the midwife from the Lakota camp, hedging his bets on who might arrive first through the winter weather. It was the midwife, a woman named Singing Grass, who made it to the ranch as Fawn's labor intensified. Xavier found himself relegated to boiling water and providing supplies, as Singing Grass took charge of the birth with calm efficiency. For hours, he paced the cabin, wincing at each of Fawn's cries, praying to a god he hadn't spoken much to since the war. Near dawn, a new cry filled the cabin, the lusty wail of a newborn taking its first breath. Singing Grass emerged from the bedroom, her weathered face split in a rare smile. "Come," she beckoned to Xavier. "Meet your son." Xavier entered the bedroom on unsteady legs to find Fawn propped up on pillows, tired but radiant, holding a small bundle wrapped in the softest blanket they owned. She looked up at him with tears of joy glistening in her eyes. "Husband," she said softly, "come see what we have made." Xavier sat carefully on the edge of the bed, overcome with emotion as Fawn placed their son in his arms. The baby had a dusting of dark hair and skin a shade lighter than Fawn's but darker than Xavier's. When he opened his eyes, they were the deep blue of all newborns, but Xavier fancied he could see both himself and Fawn in the tiny features. "He's perfect," Xavier whispered, a tear tracking down his cheek. "Absolutely perfect." They named him Thomas Swift Patterson, honoring both Xavier's father and Fawn's father in the tradition of both their cultures. As news of the birth spread, visitors came despite the winter conditions. Frank and Martha Miller bearing a handmade cradle, Swift Elk traveling through snow to bless his grandson, even Reverend Johnson making the journey to offer congratulations and perform a christening at Xavier's request. Little Thomas thrived through that winter, growing strong on his mother's milk and the boundless love of both parents. Xavier found himself transformed by fatherhood, discovering reserves of patience and tenderness he hadn't known he possessed. He would spend hours simply watching his son sleep, marveling at the miracle of his existence and the unlikely series of events that had led to his creation. "If you had not given blanket that night," Fawn remarked one evening as they sat before the fire, Thomas sleeping peacefully in the cradle nearby, "none of this would be." Xavier reached for her hand, his thumb brushing over the gold band that had replaced the silver coin on her finger. "One small act of kindness," he mused. "Who could have known it would change everything?" Fawn leaned against his shoulder, her free hand resting protectively on the cradle. "I knew," she said simply. "When you gave last blanket to stranger, I saw your heart." True hearts find each other, even in storm. As spring arrived once more, bringing with it Thomas's first smile and the ranch's busy season, Xavier reflected on the extraordinary journey of the past year. From a chance encounter in a blizzard to a family and a future he could never have imagined, his life had been utterly transformed by one simple choice to offer warmth to a stranger in need. The ranch flourished that year, as if blessed by the new life within it. Xavier and Joseph expanded the cattle operation, while Fawn established a vegetable garden that supplemented their diet and provided goods to trade with neighbors. Thomas grew rapidly, his heritage evident in his features: Xavier's square jaw, Fawn's high cheekbones, and eyes that had settled into a shade between his father's blue and his mother's brown. Summer brought visitors from both cultures. Swift Elk and his wife spent a month at the ranch, delighting in their grandson's development, while ranchers from nearby properties often stopped by with their families, children playing together regardless of background. There were still those in town who disapproved, who whispered behind their hands when the Pattersons visited Fort Laramie, but their circle of acceptance continued to widen. In late summer, as Thomas approached his 8th month, Xavier completed a project he'd been working on in secret moments: an expansion to the cabin that added a proper bedroom for their son, and a larger kitchen where Fawn could practice both American and traditional cooking. The look of joy on her face when he showed her the finished rooms was worth every splinter and aching muscle. "Our home grows as family grows," Fawn observed, exploring the new spaces with Thomas on her hip. "Room for more children someday," Xavier grinned, pulling her into a one-armed embrace. "As many as you want," he promised. "This land can support a dozen Patterson children if need be." Fawn laughed, a sound as free and joyful as the meadowlarks that sang near the creek. "Perhaps start with one more before deciding on dozen," she suggested practically. As autumn painted the surrounding hills in gold and crimson, Xavier reflected that his life had found a rhythm and purpose he'd never imagined possible. Each morning, he woke beside the woman who had literally stumbled into his life during a snowstorm. Each day, he worked the land that supported them, watched his son grow, and built a future that bridged two worlds. And each night, as he lay beside Fawn in the quiet darkness, her head pillowed on his shoulder, he remembered the simple act that had started it all: a blanket offered to a stranger in need, and marveled at how the smallest kindness could change the course of a life, and ultimately create a love that would endure through all seasons. 3 years later, the Patterson ranch had grown considerably. With careful management and hard work, Xavier had expanded his herd and his property, adding another 80 acres to the east where the grazing was particularly good. Thomas, now an active 3-year-old with his father's curiosity and his mother's quiet determination, had been joined by a baby sister, Elena Rose, born in the spring of the previous year. Fort Laramie itself was changing too. The railroad had come closer, bringing more settlers, more commerce, and more complications to the delicate balance of cultures in the region. The Lakota and other tribes faced increasing pressure on their lands and ways of life, a reality that brought Swift Elk to visit more frequently, concerned for his daughter and grandchildren's future in a rapidly changing world. On a warm day in September 1881, Xavier sat on the porch of their now substantial home, watching Thomas help Fawn in the garden while baby Elena napped in a cradle nearby. The sight filled him with a contentment so profound it almost ached. "Pa, look," Thomas called excitedly, holding up a massive carrot he'd pulled from the earth. His speech was a charming blend of proper English, Lakota phrases, and Apache words, a reflection of the rich cultural heritage his parents ensured he received. "That's a fine one, son," Xavier called back, smiling at the pride on his boy's dirt-smudged face. "Almost as big as you are." Fawn looked up, her beauty only enhanced by the passing years and the joy of motherhood. She still wore her hair in the traditional style of her mother's people on most days, though she had adopted Western dress for practical purposes around the ranch. The beaded shawl Xavier had given her that first winter remained one of her treasured possessions, now worn only for special occasions. "He grows like young oak," she observed, ruffling Thomas's dark hair affectionately. "Strong roots in good soil." Xavier nodded, understanding the deeper meaning behind her words. They had worked consciously to give their children roots in both their heritages, teaching them the values, stories, and skills of both cultures. It wasn't always easy in a world that often demanded people choose sides, but they remained committed to raising children who could navigate both worlds with confidence and pride. Later that evening, after the children were asleep, Xavier and Fawn sat together on the porch, watching the stars emerge in the vast Wyoming sky. These quiet moments had become a cherished ritual, a time to connect after the busy demands of the day. "I had letter from Singing Bear today," Fawn said, referring to the elder who had first welcomed them to the Lakota camp years ago. "Government men come again, wanting more land, offering move to reservation further north." Xavier sighed heavily. The ongoing conflicts between the government and the native peoples weighed on them both, particularly as it affected Fawn's family directly. "What does your father say?" He resists, as always. "Says our children must know their Lakota family, their ways." Fawn leaned against Xavier's shoulder. "He asks if we would consider taking in his sister's son, Blue Sky. Boy is 14, smart but caught between worlds. Father thinks he would do well here, learn ranching, learn to live in changing times." Xavier considered the request carefully. Taking in another child was no small matter, especially one approaching manhood with his own experiences and potentially his own traumas. Yet he understood Swift Elk's reasoning. Their ranch had become a rare place where both cultures were respected, where a young man might learn to navigate the complexities of a changing frontier. "If you believe we can help him, then he's welcome here," Xavier decided. "Family is family, regardless of blood." Fawn smiled, squeezing his hand gratefully. "This is why I never left your side that spring," she said softly. "Your heart remains as open as day you gave last blanket to freezing stranger." The arrival of Blue Sky 2 weeks later brought new energy to the ranch. The boy was initially reserved, watching the family dynamics with cautious eyes, but Thomas immediately adopted him as a hero, following the teenager everywhere. Elena, not yet walking but determined to keep up, would crawl after them both, laughing delightedly at their games. Xavier took Blue Sky under his wing, teaching him the business of cattle ranching, not just the physical work, but the planning, the accounts, and the negotiations that made an operation successful. The boy proved quick to learn, and brought his own knowledge of horses that impressed even the most experienced hands Xavier employed. For her part, Fawn ensured Blue Sky maintained connections to his heritage, speaking Lakota with him daily and incorporating traditional teachings into the rhythms of ranch life. It was a delicate balance, preparing him for a future that would inevitably involve more interaction with white society while honoring and preserving the wisdom of his ancestors. By Christmas of that year, Blue Sky had become an integral part of the family. His initial reticence had given way to a quiet confidence, and he had developed a particularly tender relationship with little Elena, who toddled after him calling Sky, Sky, with her arms raised to be lifted. The holiday was celebrated with elements from both cultures, a Christmas tree cut from the nearby hills and decorated with handmade ornaments, alongside a traditional Lakota winter feast and storytelling session. Swift Elk and his wife joined them, as did Frank and Martha Miller and several other neighboring families who had become friends over the years. As they gathered around the table laden with food from both traditions, Xavier looked at the faces illuminated by firelight and candles, his beautiful wife, their children, family and friends who had chosen to share their unconventional journey. His throat tightened with emotion at the realization of how full his life had become from that one night of offering shelter to a stranger. In Apache tradition, Fawn said, rising to speak before the meal, winter is time of stories. Stories teach, stories remember, stories connect. She looked around the table, meeting each person's eyes in turn. Our family's story began in worst of winter with small kindness that grew like seed in spring. She raised her glass. To kindness that changes lives, to family made by choice as well as blood, to love that bridges worlds. To love, echoed around the table as glasses clinked and smiles were exchanged. Later that night, after guests had departed and children were nestled in their beds, Xavier and Fawn stood on the porch despite the cold, looking up at stars scattered like diamonds across the Wyoming sky. "Did you ever imagine this?" Xavier asked, his arm around her waist. "That night when you collapsed in the snow, did you ever think we would build this life together?" Fawn considered the question, her breath forming clouds in the frigid air. "In that moment, I hoped only for survival until morning," she admitted. "But when you gave blanket your last blanket, something whispered to my spirit that you were different." She turned to face him, reaching up to touch his bearded cheek. "When spring came and flowers pushed through snow, I knew I would never leave your side. Some paths are written in stars before we walk them." Xavier kissed her then, as tenderly as he had on their wedding day 5 years earlier. "I'm grateful every day that your path crossed mine, Fawn Patterson," he whispered against her lips. "Every single day." As they returned to the warmth of their home, arm in arm, both knew that the journey ahead would hold challenges. The world around them was changing rapidly, often in ways that threatened the delicate balance they had established. But they had built something rare and precious on this patch of Wyoming soil, a family that honored both their heritages, a home where love transcended boundaries, a legacy their children would carry forward. And it had all begun with the simple, human gesture of sharing warmth in the depths of winter, a rancher giving his last blanket to a woman in need, and that woman choosing, when spring came, to stay by his side. Years later, when Xavier's hair had turned silver and Fawn's dark braids were streaked with gray, their grandchildren would gather around them, begging to hear the story one more time, the tale of the blanket, the blizzard, and the love that had built a bridge between two worlds. And Xavier would look at Fawn, his eyes still filled with the same tenderness, and begin. It was the coldest winter Fort Laramie had seen in 50 years.